Alright, me. It is, I think, the day after I read Aurora County All Stars, and I just read and then watched portions of Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire. Um, this play, initially written in 1947, and then I think production of it went on relatively soon afterwards, and this version of it specifically has a included version that is an introduction by Arthur Miller, the great and the wonderful Arthur Miller. So, right, Streetcar Named Desire is a lot of things, right? And I think it's helped me realize, to me, what is, like, when you look at American literature, what does it mean, and like what really makes something a piece of American literature. And to me, the biggest thing, right, is this great tragedy of space, right? And I think it's in Western culture, just because I'm just gonna say Western culture because I don't have a great familiarity with writings that come from Asia, writings that come from Africa, right? So this is European and North American, right? And I think the concept of these wide open spaces is a uniquely American thing, right? Because it's not something that exists in the same way in Germany, but that also then goes down to, right, these gaps that we have in terms of relationships, right? Because, right, that's what this is, right? It's this big, lonely, empty gap that exists between all of our characters. And within that, they find some commonality, but, right, it is those gaps that cause them to not be able to communicate with each other, right? And they're just gigantic, right? In a way that, and it's such a tragic way that I just haven't really seen in other European literature, right? So that's that, right? The Streetcar Named Desire really kind of comes down to, right, these gaps of expectation versus like reality, right? Of wealth, of gender, and of their expectations, right? All of these gaps exist in some way or another, right? To, I think, talk about gender first, right? Is we have this almost direct comparison, right, between Blanche and Stanley, right? You have this thing in which, right, and even like Steve, upstairs neighbor who's married to Eunice, there's like this, it goes, like we talked about before, of like this gender concept that exists in which men are expected to be sexually available, right? And constantly going on these escapades, right? We expect that in a societal construct. But when women do it, we see them as broken, as failures, right? And it's also very interesting because there's another difference there in which that also then plays into class, right? In which Stanley and Steve are married men, right? So there's another layer of expectation on there, on the fact that you are married, and then you are breaking that by going and having affairs, right? Whereas when Blanche was doing it, right, Blanche was a single woman who had just been widowed, right? And I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but it was her way of attempting to cope with this, right? Because as we also find out, right, the man that she had married ends up being gay, right? And it was her confrontation with that that then eventually caused her husband at the time to take his own life, right? And so, you know, she's dealing with all of that. She makes that decision where she's now widowed, but she's going to sleep with other men pretty liberally. And that is seen as a downfall. Now the question is, well, why is that considered a downfall, right? Not only does it come down to the gender and expectations of the societal rules, but it also comes down to class, right? This harkens back to the whole decadence thing that I talked about with Oscar Wilde and with Picture Dorian Gray, right? Of where we equate wealth and beauty with morality, right? And so Blanche, I start with Stanley and Steve, right? Stanley is a Polish, you know, first generation born in America. You know, he's working class, right? They're living in effectively a studio apartment in New Orleans, right? And so from a decadent standpoint of where you equate morality with wealth and with, you know, this idyllic standard, you're going to expect him not to have morals, right? Simply because of the way that we expect those two to equate with each other, right? And we still see this to this very day, right? It's an issue that we still face, right? In which we as an American society tend to be very willing to excuse the doings of the wealthy, and then when people that are poor or not financially, you know, advantaged in some way, when they do it, well, then we look down on them and we say, well, they shouldn't have done that, right? So we're still dealing with that issue, right? Because Blanche also comes from this very wealthy, well-to-do family, right? And she continues to present herself in this way, right? And so when it turns out that she did have sexual intercourse with multiple men, then it becomes an issue, right? Because now she's lying about her status, right? Lying about her status. She never actually said, oh, I'm a virgin or whatever, or I've only had sex with this one man, right? She never openly says that, but it is implied through the way that she presents herself, right? Which is once again something that we're still working through in American society to this day, right? Even though it's been almost 80 years since this play was written, right? So we're dealing with those things, right? We also have this weird things happening with Stella, right? And it's one of those things that I think speaks to, and I don't know if Tennessee Williams really meant for this to be portrayed this way, but in my mind, it really speaks to this of like how we raise kids, right? And the situations that we put ourselves in, right? because Stella, as is evidenced by the conversations and the way that Stella is treated in the first two scenes by Blanche, is we have this whole issue in which Blanche just walks all over Stella, right? And Stella claims it's always been this way, and that Stella just has to sit and listen and doesn't really get a word in edgewise, right? Which then informs how she acts with Stanley, right? Because that is the situation in which he is raised, in which, even though I think it ends up being described that she is technically a year older than Blanche, but Stella still acts as if she is the smaller sister, right? Not because she is in years smaller, but because she is mentally and in willpower smaller, right? And so then we get this whole thing in which, right, we can see that she doesn't ever stand up for herself and is so willing to go back to Stanley after being abusive, because that's the way that she has been raised her entire life, is to just stand up, or I should say just to sit back and just to accept it as it is, right? The famous example being the Stella scene, right, in which the huge blow up happens during the poker night. They go upstairs to Eunice's apartment on the upstairs floor, they being Stella and Blanche, because Stanley has just hit Stella. But in the middle of the night, Stella sneaks back down, and they go and they have sex, right? Because it is this sort of like obsessive kind of love, right? Of where they're both so enamored by this concept of what the other is that they don't see that they're destroying each other, right? One more so than the other, but they're both destroying each other. And so, right, it's this, to me, it's this thing of like, you know, abusive relationships, well, they usually stem from something. Well, in this case, what does it stem from? Well, it stems from the fact that Stella has always had to be not complacent, but withdrawn and willing to accept it. Yes, cat? Yes, cat. There's also this great thing of like, from an overall standpoint, right, I would argue that the play itself is actually mostly about this separation between fantasy and reality, right? Because inherently, Blanche lives in this world of, you know, just absolute fantasy, right? Blanche du Bois, meaning White Forest, right? But also just this realm of like having this, right, wealth that is accrued through generations and generations, right? It's mostly on the backs of others, right? But also just this immense wealth that has come from that, and the expectations that arrive from that. She's in by far the vast minority in that situation, right? And so when she has to remove herself from that and comes back down to reality, right, the reality that the majority of America lives in, well, she can't handle it, right? You know, and it's not a good, positive reality. It's an abusive reality. It's a distant reality. But it's that gap that ends up being crossed that then destroys Blanche, right? You know, that is what starts the spiral. And then the assault by by Stanley onto Blanche when she's already in her spiral just makes everything way worse, destroys everything. Everything falls apart, right? But right, it's that reality versus fantasy that this play really comes down to, right? And I don't think it's just a oopsie that Tennessee Williams names Blanche White Forest, right? I think it's very intentional of like this concept of what we now know as white privilege, but just this generalized concept of generational wealth, right? And then the coming back down to what is actually happening in America. The ending scene, right? I watched the snippet from the 1951 or 52 version of it, and that version I think destroys this ending, right? That movie destroys this ending because Stella does the thing that we want her to do. Stella takes the child and runs to Eunice and says she's never going back, right? That's what we want Stella to do. But what happens in the play? Well, in the play, we learn that this last scene, scene 11, skips forward a couple weeks, right? And scene 10, 9 or 10, I don't remember which one it is, but we learn that Stanley has booked a train or a bus for Blanche to leave that Tuesday. We get to scene 11 and we learn that it's been a couple weeks. And they're shipping her out to the country, right? Presumably to an asylum of some sort. And Stella gives her reasoning for it, right? And Stella's reasoning for it is, well, after she told me that story, I couldn't live with Stanley knowing that she was still in the house, knowing that she was still around. So I had to make a decision. And she chooses, right? Stella ends up choosing to be on her husband's side, right? And part of that, I argue, comes down to this whole generalized concept of societal expectations, but also class, right? Of where, or class and wealth in terms of gender, right? There is no way for Stella and Blanche to make a positive living together. There's just not, right? Because number one, like they don't have, right? They're used to this generational wealth and living standard. Number two, there's just not the same job opportunities available to them. Number three, right? Because they lived in this generational wealth situation, right? They don't have this sort of skills that would make them immediately employable, right? And so Stella in that situation has to stay with Stanley, even though her sister has just told her that her husband has assaulted her. But then when the doctors actually come, right, and they're trying to take Blanche away, right, then everyone realizes that she was right, right? They come to this understanding, Mitch being the first one, but both Mitch and Stella come to this realization that, like, yeah, what has caused this actual spiral has been Stanley's treatment of her this entire time, right? And so we get the whole breakdown, we get everything. The actual ending bit has Stella with the baby in her arms, crying, absolutely beside herself because she's just let her sister go to an asylum. And her husband, Stanley, as described, comes up to her and tries to comfort her and finds the opening in her blouse to try to comfort her, which speaks to this whole issue that, like, you know, this is a relationship that is entirely built on sex, right? It's built on sex and power dynamics, right? And this is a man who has nothing else to give besides sex, and we learn that throughout the entire play. He doesn't have any other qualities besides the fact that he's attractive and he's good at sex. Right? There is nothing else there, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, it's one of the, I think, most important American tragedies, right? Just because there is no positivity in this, right? There is nothing there, right? It is this immense downfall of what American society and what American expectations are, right? And I keep referring to it as simply American is because that's the culture that I'm aware of, right? Not to say that other cultures don't have issues like this, but right, this is, right, shows this complete and absolute power imbalance that exists, right? And even in the end, you know, all that can be done is sex, right? I think the ending part, and I know I'm talking a whole bunch, but the ending part also speaks to me about a current American issue of where people are getting angry at women for wanting to divorce or wanting to not have children or have abortions, right? Because they're citing, like, hey, you know, this isn't something that we want. One of the things that they're citing is that this man is not, you know, the person I'm with is not fit to be a father, right? And the response is, well, you know, you should have thought that before you had sex with them. But this is a play that I think gives us a good look into that, right? Of where you don't understand who a person is until you give them power, right? But also, right, children change things and babies change things, right? And the person that you think that you're meeting, right, if we like take a look at Mitch, right, throughout the entire play we're thinking that, oh, he's this nice guy, he's different than all the other guys, you know, he's caring for his mother, right? He's trying to exit poker games and whatnot, right? But as soon as he gets power and as soon as he's angry, right, he goes off the handle, right? And it's one of those things of, like, you know, you don't always fully understand what you're getting yourself into, right? That's that. That is A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. Absolute tragedy, but very wonderful.